Alrighty, well, I'm gonna regale you all now with with a couple of stories from the 1970s. When I was a child growing up, I was born in 1968, so I grew up I was an infant and a toddler in the late 60s and into the very early 70s. I was a toddler, and I was a little boy in the early 70s, and so on. And yeah, anyway, again, this is if we can make the, oh, wait a minute, here we go. Okay, this is Central Wire, which is the factory I ended up working in from 1983 when I was 15 years old and left home until 1987. But what I want to show you here is this house here used to be a grocery store. In fact, see, there's two doors there. There's still two doors there. These are Google Maps images. Anyway, one door used to go into the storekeeper's house. The other door used to go into this area right here, which was the store. That window was actually in the store. It was a little grocery store. It was called Quinn's Grocery Store. In those days, practically every corner in town had a little grocery store or a gas station on it. Anyway, this was Quinn's Grocery Store. And I remember a bunch of us kids, all neighbor kids of mine and so on. I remember one time back in it would have been around 1973, in the summertime, we walked into town, and I remember one of the kids, it was actually our landlord's daughter. They had two daughters. She had some errands to run in town. Anyway, and she was a little older than I was, but not by a lot, but a little bit. And I remember a bunch of us walked into town with her. Anyway, and she ran her errands and stuff. We kind of tagged along with her. And then on the way back, we stopped at Quinn's Grocery Store, and we got, I remember I had a nickel. I had one 5-cent piece. That was all the money I had to my name at the time. And I came out of that store with a penny in my pocket and 2 pixie sticks, which was like a paper straw full of like sugar, fruit-flavored sugar. I bought 2 pixie sticks because they cost 2 cents a piece in those days, and I had a nickel. So I got 2 pixie sticks, and I got a penny in change. Anyway, that was called Quinn's Grocery Store. Now, years later, there was another store called Quinn's Grocery Store in town. But back when this place was called Quinn's Grocery Store, the store that eventually ended up being called Quinn's Grocery Store was called Bowles's Grocery Store. Bowles's. And then Mr. Bowles sold that to a fellow by the name of Ed Quinn, and it became Quinn's Grocery Store. But this is a different thing. There's no connection. This particular Quinn's Grocery Store is a different thing. And this grocery store closed up years before the other grocery store became Quinn's Grocery Store. When this was still on the go, that grocery store was called Bowles's Grocery Store. Anyway, enough of that. Most of you listening have no idea what I'm talking about right now, so we'll move on. Unless you're from the town, you'd never know what I was talking about, really. But anyway, that used to be a little grocery store. We'll go ahead up this way now again. Take a trip down memory lane. Here we go now. Come, take a trip with me down memory lane. Here we go now. Okay. Now, this building right here, let me get in here good. I've got a good story about this building. This building is actually the old shoe factory. And back in the 20s and 30s, and on up into the 50s and so on, this was a shoe factory. This is where people worked making shoes. In fact, my old friend that I told you about, who used to go to the dances there above where the workshop was there at the wrecking yard. In my other video, I talk about him and the story he told about how a couple of fellas at one of these dances decided they were going to fight. And Sam there, who was the man who put the dance on, who owned the property, he got between them and put a stop to it before it could go very far. Anyway, that fellow actually met his wife when she was working in that shoe factory in like the mid 1950s. She was boarding at a boarding house in town, and she was working in the shoe factory, and she was getting paid $28 a week. That was her pay to work in the shoe factory, $28 a week. Anyway, my family has quite a few connections to this factory and to the Brown Shoe Factory in general, to the Brown Shoe Company. A lot of people in the town of Perth do. It employed a lot of people for a lot of years. That factory went out of business in, the shoe factory in Perth went under in 2002, I believe. Either 2002 or 2003. And this factory was closed up, though, as a factory around 1959, 1960, when a new factory was built. And this factory became a warehouse. And when I was a little boy, this factory was a warehouse. That's what it was. Anyway, my grandpa, on my dad's side of the family, my dad's dad was the head electrical engineer for the Brown Shoe Company in Canada, for all their factories and buildings in Canada. My dad was a tool and die maker and an industrial mechanic for the Brown Shoe Company. I have an uncle who was an office manager for the Brown Shoe Company. And pretty well everybody who grew up in Perth had family and acquaintances and so on who worked at the Brown Shoe Factory. It was a big employer in Perth for many years. My grandpa actually worked in that factory back in the 1930s. And he was a union man back then, and they went on strike. And I have an old picture of them all standing in front of the factory, all the strikers. And anyway, there's a story actually kind of funny about that. This was in the late 1930s that they went on strike because they were getting paid starvation wages. They couldn't survive on it. In fact, my dad was born in 1937, and my grandmother actually broke my dad's toes trying to squeeze his feet into shoes that were too small for him, because the pay here was that bad. And here they were making shoes, and yet my grandpa couldn't afford to buy new shoes for his son, who had outgrown his old shoes. And my grandmother was so desperate to get him into the shoes, she tried forcing his feet into the shoes, ended up breaking his toes. So, like I say, that's how bad things were, and so those men had good reason to go on strike. Anyway, at that time, that was called the Perth Shoe Company. It was before the Brown Group of companies had bought it out. The Brown Group bought it out in the late 50s, and they're based in St. Louis, Missouri. So they're an American outfit. Anyway, on with the show. I'll tell you the story here. Let me move ahead a little bit to give you something a little more interesting to look at. This is now a bunch of boutiques and coffee shops and things. It sat abandoned for quite a few years, and then it was a bunch of boutiques and coffee shops. But in the 1970s, when I was growing up, this was a warehouse for the shoe factory. In fact, people used to park their cars right along there. That was all concrete, and you'd park your car there. But if you were going in there to work or whatever. Anyway, the story with the strike, though, back in the 1930s, the company hired a bunch of what they called scab laborers to work in there during the during the strike, basically to replace the striking workers. Well, I guess the payroll was being brought in by the Ontario Provincial Police. They had a 1937 Plymouth Coupe. That was their patrol car in town. And they were bringing the payroll in for the scab workers. And they had to cross the picket line to bring the payroll in. Well, I guess a bunch of the strikers surrounded the police car, and they actually turned it over, put it on its roof. They did. They turned the police car over right on its roof because the cop was trying to bring the money in to pay the scab workers, Anyway, so that, back then people didn't fool around, Anyway, but the story I'm going to tell today about this place is I love to go there with my dad. I really love that old building. It was a really neat old place, and it had the old rope elevators where you had to open a wooden gate that covered the opening to the elevator shaft, and you step onto the elevator and you actually pulled ropes to make the elevator go up and down. And anyway, there was a sign on each gate, because each floor had a gate for the elevator shaft. And there was a sign on the gate telling you, make sure the elevator is there before you step out into the elevator shaft, Because if you open that gate, you could just step right out and into the elevator shaft. Anyway, there was a man that worked in there, and he was missing an eye. One of his eyes was just all closed up. He didn't have a glass eye or anything. He just had one eye that was permanently closed. And it was because he was missing an eye. And that fella was a lot of fun. I really liked him. Whenever I go there, I love to see that guy. Because what he'd do is, they had these big wheeled carts that they moved the boxes of shoes around on. And this is back when I was like 5, 6, 7 years old. Back in like the early 1970s anyway. He would have me up onto one of those carts, and he'd just run me from one end of the building to the other on that cart. Oh, I'd laugh. I thought that was just the greatest thing, and I really loved to see that guy anyway. I used to just be, oh yeah, we're going to go for a ride, But anyway, it turns out how he lost his eye is actually really sad. He lived in a house not very far away from this building, actually, just up one of the side streets from this building. And he was married, and I guess he came home from work one night and his wife had left him. She left a note on the table or whatever, on the kitchen table, a Dear John letter. She just decided she didn't want to be with him anymore. I don't know what the story was. I don't know anything about it, really, what her reasons were, but she did decide she was leaving him, and she did leave him. And so she left the note on the table, and that was it. She was gone. Well, that fella, he had a nervous breakdown, and he went under his front porch, and he'd bark like a dog at anybody who walked past there on the sidewalk. He'd just start barking at them. And he stayed under his front porch for days. Well, finally, the police came up there, and they got him out from under there, and they took him to a hospital, and he ended up in a hospital for quite a while. And when he got out, they had him doped right up. He was on heavy-duty medication anyway, I guess. His mind had really been affected, And he had a breakdown, basically. And anyway, I guess he was at work one day, and he was so out of it from being drugged up that he opened up the wooden gate, and he stepped out into the elevator shaft, and there was no elevator there. And that's how he lost his eye. I guess something on the way down, something caught him in the face and took his eye out. A hook, and it was coming out of the wall or something. So that's how he lost his eye, anyway. And so he had one side of his face, you could tell, was badly damaged, and And the eye on that side of his face was all closed up. I can't remember if it was the right side or the left side. I remember him. I can picture him clearly. But for some reason, I can't remember which eye it was, which side of his face was buggered up. But that was from falling down the elevator shaft anyway. So it's kind of a sad story, I guess, in that sense. But he was a lot of fun anyway. I really liked when he'd run me to the other end of the factory on the cart, Anyway, it was a really neat old building. And when I worked for Central Wire actually bought that building. And they started using it as a warehouse. And they mainly bought it for the parking lot, because the shoe factory had always let them use the parking lot for employees. And they were afraid if somebody else bought the building, they would lose the use of the parking lot. And they really didn't have a big parking lot that could accommodate all the employees at that time. So that's the reason they bought the building, was mainly for the parking lot. But then after that, they moved out of it. I don't know if they sold it to somebody or what, but it sat empty for a long time. And then it was bought by somebody who now is, like I say, they've got coffee shops and boutiques and things like that in there. Let's go ahead here a little bit. But yeah, I can still picture my dad's 1969 Ford LTD parked there, right about there. But yeah, anyway, it was a huge building. And I knew every inch of it. There wasn't a square foot of that building I hadn't walked through at one time or another. Really neat old place. But anyway, but yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. Anyway, I remember that. But there was a boiler in there to heat the building. And in the early 70s, the company that made that boiler had already been out of business for like 80 years or something, or 90 years. I forget what my dad said exactly, but a long time. As of course, you couldn't get parts for it anymore, and it would break down. And my dad would have to get it running again. And he hated that boiler with a passion. He had to make parts for it and everything. He used to actually have to get right inside of the boiler and pull the big tubes out of it and put them on a kind of a thing there, like a stand, and then he could pound on them with a hammer to get all the soot out of them and stuff and put them all back. And but he'd come out of there, he'd be black. All you'd see is his white eyes, he'd just be black from head to toe from all the soot and everything. He'd literally be inside the boiler. He hated that thing with a passion, and it broke down a lot. And I remember that. He just hated it. Despised it, really. And dreaded having to get back into it and get it going again to keep the building heated. But yeah, I remember that. Anyway, that was another story. But anyway, yeah, lots of stories. But that's it, I guess. I'll just take you to the other end of it here. Might as well. We're going for a drive. We're going for a drive on the street here, we are. For me, this is the closest I've gotten to driving in quite a while. There we go. You can see it's a big building. It goes back a ways. There it is there. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, big old building. And anyway, like I say, I spent some time there when I was growing up anyway. I knew that building really well. That's it. That's another story to tell. I'm thinking of all these things. What happens when you get old, I guess. You start taking stock and thinking of all the things you remember from when you were a kid and when you were young and everything. How much the world has changed in your lifetime and so on, Anyway, hope you're all having a wonderful night, and Rocky and I will see you later. Bye for now.